Okay, so hello everyone. I wanted to go over a new topic in social studies with you called Westward expansion. And basically, what that means is that at a certain point in time in history, after the Civil War had ended, that was when the North and the South were fighting. Um, as time went on, they wanted to explore and see what was out west. The United States was very large, and so they hadn't really settled in many areas out west. So they wanted to go out there and explore, and they sent some explorers. Some explorers, names like Lewis and Clark, went out there, which we'll talk more about on another day. But it was important for our country to expand and to settle into other areas, especially these unexplored areas of the West. So that's what today's topic is going to be about today. So think about it. If your family was moving across the country to a place where there was nothing in the place where you were moving to, there were no houses or stores or anything like that, what are some things that you would definitely want to pack and why? So, like, you don't have to answer that. Just think about it. I want you guys thinking about what are some things that you would need to have with you when you moved, okay? And then I want you to also think about what are some qualities that a pioneer might have. Like a pioneer might have to be brave, resourceful, okay? They might have to be knowledgeable in the areas of where they're going, as far as learning about um, the environment they're going to be in, because the environment out west and climates and weather out west is much different than it is on the east coast. So this was sort of like a learning curve for them. So they needed really to kind of have some kind of understanding of what they were getting into and to be resourceful, meaning they can use their what they know and their imaginations to help them with problems they might run into. So here is basically where we're looking at. In this orange here, this was sort of the area that was originally settled. Okay, we had the 13 colonies here across the coast, then we started to expand out. But all of this land was still up for grabs. And I don't mean that it was free, because there were Native Americans living there. And as we know, the settlers eventually come in and take over. But so their Native Americans were living in this part, but Americans, the colonists who had settled here on the East Coast, hadn't really been out here. So they wanted to get out there and see what was going on. Okay, so where did they go? Well, most pioneers had left their homes in the East, which is over here, and headed westward toward the Great Plains in the West. That's this red area here. The Great Plains is a huge area of grassland between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. So this is where a lot of the pioneers were headed. And why? What was it so special about moving out west? Well, there was rumors of gold. Something called the gold rush did happen, which we might get into again on another date. But a lot of people had moved west to California to mine for gold, to dig up gold. Okay, there was like a gold fever, they called it. Everyone wanted gold. Okay. Also, they were giving out free land. The government was actually saying, hey, we will give you land if you go out there and you build and you help us out. So that was called the Homestead Act, and that was those who were eligible, who could. The U.S. gave them this is a lot now, 160 acres of land. That is quite large. That is a huge amount of land to give somebody. In order to qualify for that, you had to be 21 years old or older and head of household who agreed to build on and care for the land. So you had to agree to go out there, build on it, and care for that land if they were going to give it to you. Okay. And many people just wanted an adventure and to escape out of the everyday life that they were living on the east side. So many moved simply just to get out and see what else was out there. And they didn't really care what was out there. They were just trying to get out because maybe they were getting out of a bad situation they were in the East, or they just wanted to see something new. Okay, so something called manifest destiny comes up a lot with this, and it was just that many believe that they were destined or meant to expand the U.S. from sea to shining sea, and that is a part of a song that we sing. But basically, all they wanted to do, what they believed was, it was that the Americans needed to expand and explore the country from the East Coast water, so the Atlantic Ocean, all the way to the West Coast, which was the Pacific Ocean. Okay, and There were some ways that they got there. Mostly they were done by horse-drawn wagons. So most families had packed up their things, their valuables, anything that they needed, and put it in a covered wagon, which you see in this picture down here. And these groups of wagons were called wagon trains, which they just traveled together and then kind of one behind each other. So it almost formed a train. The family members did take turns riding in wagons and walking beside the wagons. So because there wasn't enough space for all the family to always sit, so some people had got to sit on the wagon, and then others had to walk, and then they would take turns. Okay, and then they had captains who were just kind of leaders, and they would often lead these wagon trains. Okay. Some of the things that they had to face were dangerous. They, were able to bring some food and water with them, but eventually they would run out. So they would have a lack of, meaning not enough of food, water, and shelter. They also didn't have a lot of protection from the weather. So if it was raining, if it was snowing, if there was a tornado, if there was a hurricane, floods, that would be problematic for these pioneers, for these people going out west. The lack of medicine and medical care wasn't as what it is today. So if somebody got even just like a small cold, it could really affect them and they could even die from it. But that was because they don't have what we have today. But back then, anything minor, or if they got a cut and it got infected and they had nothing to care for it, they could die. So the lack of medical care was an issue as well. And then they were experiencing, these face-offs with Native Americans. Native Americans, they were there first, so they felt like their land was being taken from them, which it was in a sense. So they were they often had conflict with the Native Americans, and fight would break out because the Native Americans were protecting the land that they were originally the owners of. But the pioneers were coming and saying, you know what, like, we're here to expand, we're here to take over, we're here to build. So there was often conflict and problems between the two groups. Also, there was conflict within each other's group of settlers. They sometimes were competing for land, for resources like waters and animals and trees. Sometimes they say a small range war broke out, meaning just like there was some small battle or conflict between settlers in a certain area. But these were feuds between neighboring settlers. So people who were kind of settling nearby, they would kind of argue over the land and resources. And what was the life like living out there on the prairie? Well, many arrived to find huge empty areas of land. They did build homes out of log and sod. They had to find sources of water and food. Some lived near creeks or rivers, so that was very, very helpful. While others had to make windmills to pump the water out of the ground. So they had to build these windmills to get the water pumping. So some had it easier than others. Many were miles from their nearest neighbor or trading post, so they kind of felt lonely sometimes. The harsh weather that we talked about earlier was also an issue. And they had to realize that there was different soil for raising crops and animals. So depending on the type of soil that their land was on, they could grow some crops, but they might not be able to grow all different crops and produce because of that. All right, and so this was just like in a picture of a sod house. This is a sod house here and some teepees. Okay. This was a quote from a prairie woman, person living out in the Midwest. It might seem a cheerless life, but there were many compensations. The thrill of conquering a new country, the wonderful atmosphere, the attraction of the prairie, which simply gets into your blood and makes you dissatisfied away from it. The pioneer spirit was continuous in our family. Basically, what this means was that it was adventurous, the thrill of being in an unknown area. A lot of people were comforted by that. They liked that. They liked being in the unknown and sort of starting fresh and from scratch with a new house or anything like that. So they really, really enjoyed that. Unfortunately, and part of history is that many of the Native Americans, they were unfairly driven from the lands that they lived on, meaning they were kicked out, even though they were there before the U.S. government became official. The government said, no, this is our land, so you have to get out. And they kind of moved them to reservations, which is just an area where they kept them all together. So that was really unfortunate part of history. And then herds of wild bison became nearly extinct, and extinct means they were almost completely gone. We didn't have them anymore because what was happening is these settlers needed them for sources of food and shelter. They would use their skin for clothing, maybe for a roof. They would use the meat for food, obviously. So those were some unfortunate parts of it. But eventually, there were so many people and settlers and pioneers that traveled west that small cities and towns started to pop up in the west. Many families grew and expanded as they lived in the west, and the immigrants moved into the west as well. These westward areas were eventually added as states, which are much more popular today. So as these areas expanded and the population of people grew, this is what turned into more states, and eventually we got up to the amount of states that we have, which is the 50 states. Okay. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed that lesson, and we will be talking more about westward expansion as we continue on. Okay, take care.